Great, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the invitation. Yes. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honour to be here, slightly outside my normal habitat, but wind more than sing. And as Matthias said, what I want to talk to you about is based on my recently completed doctoral studies at the University of Nottingham a few years ago, which then made their way into a monograph, which has been published by Rutledge's Science and Theology series. I'm going to try and operate two laptops simply because we don't know how to do the presenter view without a see. So let me know if they go out of sync. Okay. Okay. So my objectives are to introduce Maximus's Logoi cosmology, which is really quite famous. You may already know a lot about it. And I'm going to assess some recent claims that it resembles reminiscent of biological evolution. And I'm going to suggest also, although we don't have so much time on this, how Maximus's Logoi cosmology can shed light on not just the theology of evolution, but maybe the philosophy of nature as well. And in passing, I want to illustrate this as perhaps a way of doing science-engaged theology, which is probably not done with patristics, certainly not with Eastern patristics. So a lot of resources available, lots of new interfacial work to be done in that area. But I think it's important to manage expectations by stating up front the genre and the positioning of this research. So it's, as I've said, science-engaged theology, or theology of science, which sits at the intersection, in my case, of patristics, constructive theology, natural sciences, and philosophical theology. And I'm operating in dialogue mode or synthesis mode rather than conflict or independence or integration. And to that end, I'm going to state up front that I'm assuming that Darwinian evolution and the ancillary mechanisms are the best scientific explanation for how life arose on our planet. I'm not going to be entertaining any kind of polemical confrontations between Maximus and those who would deny evolution. I also don't think I'm breaking any new ground in patristic exegesis, philosophy or science per se, although at times I might be favouring certain well-established alternative interpretations of Maximus. And some of you might be thinking, how on earth can you bring together these very, very disparate thought worlds? Isn't there a risk of kind of eisegesis, anachronisms, reading modern ideas into ancient writing? Well, that is clearly a risk. And you'll have to judge for yourself whether I do that. But my aim really is to read one through the lens of the other, see what new insights can be brought to bear. So just bringing different texts into conversation with each other, as it were. So who was Maximus in evolution, and why probably evolution? Well, as most of you all know, Maximus was a very famous Christian monk and theologian from the 6th, 7th century, martyred for his stance on the monothelite controversy, whether Christ had one will or two wills, tortured by having his tongue cut out and his right hand amputated by the emperor. He has he's very influenced by many different streams of thought and represents a kind of high point in Eastern patristics. So influenced by Pseudo-Dionysius, Evagrius Ponticus, Cappadocian Church Fathers, Maximus of Emesa, and the Neoplatonists. And arguably, that high point wasn't seen again until Gregory of Plotinus 700 years later. There has been a huge renaissance of interest in Maximus over the last 50 years. Enormous amount of new work's been done on him, although it has to be said that there's a relative paucity of engagement with natural sciences, particularly biological sciences, even though he has an awful lot to say about creation and protology in terms of the Logos and the Logoi. And some things have been said about how it resembles evolution. At a conference like this, I don't really need to say much about the philosophical background to the Logoi, except to mention the way that Maximus expanded and Christianized the concept. One of his motivations was to refute or correct Origenism by arguing that the refraction of the Logos into creation means that all creation is as essentially good and theophanic as the letters of Scripture and the person of Christ, a cosmic incarnation, if you like. A lot has been written on what the Logoi are metaphysically and theologically for Maximus, whether they are divine ideas, divine wills, divine energies, or the very person, second person of the Trinity. I don't really want to get into that debate here, except to say that for Maximus, there are no medium intermediate terms denoting a chain of being, but the whole of God is present in each of the individual logoi, or the logos is the logoi, and the logoi are the logos. My motivations originally, this is when I was doing my master's here at Cambridge, actually, I noticed in the secondary literature a number of tantalizing, intriguing references by certain scholars operating at the interface between science and theology to how the logoi resemble evolution or genetics. So I have a number of quotes here. I don't have time to show them all. One is by Christopher Southgate in his famous book, Groaning of Creation, in 2008, where he said that organisms and species are best seen as representing points and peaks within evolutionary fitness landscapes. Every peak has a possibility imagined in the mind of God, hence possessing, in Maximus's terms, logoi, divinely given patterns of being. Now, what he was referring to here is Sewell Wright, famous geneticist, American geneticist from the 20th century, had this conceptual model of populations migrating across this landscape, phenotypic landscape of different characteristics, like beak length or arm length or something, and then plotted in the Z direction against fitness, evolutionary fitness. And the idea is that populations will be attracted over generations by natural selection to peaks and eventually become reproductively isolated and then form new species. So Southgate was saying that the peaks of those fitness landscapes correspond to the logoi. More recently, Elizabeth Theocritoff here in Cambridge said that the logoi might be seen as something like spiritual DNA, the code of letters that enables the creature to actualize itself. And then even more recently, Mark Chenoweth said that evolution moves forward through various logoi, fulfilling God's plan for the world. And there are, as I said, more where those came from. But despite these casual allusions, there wasn't any sustained attempt to interpret specifically the logoi in the light of evolution. So the aim of my doctoral work was to try to rectify that situation. And a preview or summary of my argument is as follows. I'll start by showing that there are indeed some ways in which the logoi resemble DNA and biological evolution, but also then go on to point out a number of slightly troubling dissimilarities or dissonances, which nonetheless can be, to some extent, accommodated or mitigated by a correct understanding of Maximus, and also possibly by drawing in later Eastern Orthodox ideas. And the end result, I'm going to argue, is that there is a distinctively immanentist and particularist understanding of evolution that you can derive from Maximus. So first of all, I will start with those features of the logoi that show some obvious synergy or concordance with evolution. So these are the defining logoi, the moving logoi, the temporal logoi, and the entangled logoi. So first of all, the defining one. The logoi, first of all, account for the similarities and differences of all creatures. In the Book of Difficulties, the Ambiguo number 22, Maximus says, if the many things are different, it must be understood their logoi, according to which they essentially exist, are also different, since it is in these, or rather because of these logoi, that different things differ. Secondly, the Logoi define particulars or individuals as well as universals and species, which is quite an important point amongst colleagues interested in Platonism. Maximus says in Ambiguum 22, the whole of God is indivisibly present in each particular thing, according to the Logos through which that thing exists in its own way. And God is whole in all things commonly and in each being particularly. Thirdly, I think that for Maximus, the Logoi are constitutively immanent. And by immanent, I don't just mean near or present, like Augustine said, water splitting a sponge, but interior or inherent. He says in Questions to Thalassios, the Logoi exist within beings and create the essences of those beings and preserve them in existence. And in various other places, he says the Logoi are either implanted, intermingled, engrafted, or embedded. And finally, on the subject of defining, the Logoi emanate from the Logos without diminishment, without declension. Maximus says in Ambiguum 42, if beings possess perfection by divine foreknowledge, but emerge as imperfect when they enter existence by means of creation, then either they are not that which was foreknown, but something other, or else the difference between the two constitutes a clear weakness on the part of the Creator, who was not able to realize fully in creation what he had envisaged in his foreknowledge. So it's not kind of participatory, shadowing or echoing of the ideal archetypes. This is like almost a univocal bridging. So from these texts, it seems that Maximus understands creation to be configured and imbued by the Logoi. And depending on one's understanding of what the Logoi are, this means that creation is in some sense divine, because whether the Logoi are thought of as ideas, wills, energies, or person, each of the Logoi is itself a Logos. One way of expressing this philosophically is to say that God the Son is the intrinsic formal cause of all things, not just an extrinsic archetype or exemplar, but also immanently present. One way of expressing this scientifically is to say that the Logos supplies the information content of the world, the form, shape, intelligibility of everything. Of course, this raises a lot of questions and concerns, which I don't have time to go into, but for now, I label this interpretation of Maximus as a species of panentheism, not pantheism, panentheism, or at least an anticipation of it, because panentheism is a very modern term that doesn't really apply to ancient thought. In other words, in some sense, the world is in God and God is in the world, with God not orchestrating from a distance, but in union with it and indwelling it. God is incarnate in the world, not just as the historical person of Jesus Christ, but as the cosmic Christ. It therefore follows that the whole of the world ought to be revealing God's presence, which it does, at least to those with the eyes of faith. And you could also regard it as a combination. Maximus is very clear, creation is from nothing, but he talks about it being from God and from nothing, which sort of captures the freedom God has and the fact that God's not a material cause, whilst at the same time saying that all of intelligibility must come from God, since there is nowhere else for it to come from. So this is a rather complicated diagram. It's my attempt, an amateurish attempt to show one interpretation, static model of the Logos world interaction. So if we take this butterfly, the Red Admiral Vanessa Atalanta, that particular individual is configured from within, from the Logoi of being, as an intrinsic formal cause and final cause, giving it constitutive immanence in a univocal way. I realize univocity is a later medieval term, but I think the particularity Maximus is insistent upon means that there is more of a univocal bridging, at least between the intelligibility and the energies that exist around God, the participle, uncreated energies that Maximus talks about. But Maximus is also quite clear that there's a lot of participation going on. So the beauty of that butterfly will be participating in beauty with a capital B. So those represent the ex deo elements. But on the right-hand side, the ex nihilo element is what you might call the apophatic alterity, equivocity between what's instantiated in the finite mode of existence compared to what was in God eternally. So that's captured by Maximus's use of the word tropos, hypoxios, or hypostasis, finite mode of existence. Maximus says in Ambiguum 17, if you strip away all of the logoi, you end up being speechless because all you find is pure power. So anyway, that's one interpretation. Moving on to the more dynamic aspects of the logoi. So Maximus describes motion of the logoi in three ways: a journey of becoming in three stages in one of his many triads, a procession and return, and an expansion and contraction. So in this triad, Maximus speaks of the logoi journeying from an initial state of being to an intermediate state of well-being, to a final end state, eternal well-being. The first stage of the journey is from eternal pre-existence in God as an idea or will into a finite mode of existence. Second represents the actions that rational creatures at least take to flourish in well-being, to align their tropos with their logos. And Maximus does seem to restrict this to rational creatures who uniquely have the power to change their mode. And then the last stage in the triad is transtemporal deification, when you cross over from space-time to being with union with God. And you notice this is a reverse sort of Origen's, starting with stasis or monet, followed by kinesis and Genesis. It's starting with Genesis for Maximus. The second aspect is the concept of procession and return. So Maximus says, according to the creative and sustaining procession of the one to individual beings, the one is many. According to the reverted, inductive, and providential return of the many to the one. And then he has in bracket, as if to an all-powerful point of origin or the center of a circle, pre-containing the beginnings of the radii originating from it. Insofar as the one gathers everything together, the many are one. This concept of procession return goes back, of course, to Neoplatonic thinking of the one emanating itself into the many, and the many collapsing back down into the one. And borrowing from both Dionysius and Plotinus, he pictures this relationship as a kind of starburst or a wheel, with the center being the one and the logoi being the radii and spokes. So diagrammatically, I represent it here on the left with the outward going, the procession, and then the return the other way around. The last aspect is expansion and contraction, diastole and systole. Maximus says that substance of all beings has been set in motion and continues to move according to the principle and mode of expansion and contraction. Where it is moved from the most generic genus through the most generic genera to particular species, through which and in which it's naturally divided, proceeding down to the most specific species, where its expansion comes to a limit. And once again, it's gathered back from the most specific kind of species, moving back through more and more generic categories until it's gathered up into the most generic genus. So here Maximus goes further than a simple procession of the many from the one and a return of the many to the one. He adds extra detail whereby the most generic substance subdivides as it expands into ever more specific categories until it reaches the most specific species. And then the process is reversible. He's got this idea probably from Porphyry, but I won't go into that now. Maximus is not entirely clear on how these three different kinds of movement are interrelated. One interpretation from the Maximus scholar Thorstein Tollefsen is that the triadic journey of the Logos and the Neoplatonic procession and return refer to cosmological and an ontological sequence, whereas the expansion and contraction is more of a conceptual or contemplative movement. So this is starting to look a bit like the hierarchical organization of life that results from phylogenetic descent, with the branch points closest to the center corresponding to higher taxa, such as kingdoms, phyla, classes, while the branch points furthest away correspond to families, genera, and species. It could, however, be a purely conceptual metaphysical scheme. After all, it was possible to classify organisms in this way long before evolution was ever imagined. But what makes this closer, I think, to real evolutionary change is what Maximus has to say about time. Maximus's vision of the Logoi expanding, contraction, acting, processing, and reverting is not just an abstract contemplation of the hierarchical order of nature. The movement is also at least partly temporal. Maximus says, by his word and in his wisdom, he created and continues to create all things, universals as well as particulars, at the appropriate time, chronon. Individual things were created at the appropriate moment in time, kairo, in a manner consistent with their logoi, and thus they receive themselves actual existence as beings. So the movement is at least, to some extent, temporal. And it suggests we can put a time axis on the expanding circle diagram, turning it from a mere conceptual hierarchy into ontological, historical movement. It also means, very importantly, for me, working at the interface between science and theology, that there's a possibility of some engagement, because if it was purely metaphysical, it might be difficult to have any kind of conversation with natural science. So there I have added the time axis, so the outward going part happens, but it starts off in God's eternal mind, so to speak, but it then goes into space-time. And then when it comes to deification, that happens outside, beyond time. The resulting picture bears a striking resemblance to circular depictions of the tree of life, as you can see here on the right. So Maximus's vision is even attuned to those modern views of evolution which seek to avoid a progressivist bias of vertically pointing tree diagrams by replacing them with diagrams having rotational symmetry, so that the human species doesn't have any priority because it's just one member on the circumference of all life. Finally, although the temporal expansion of the Logoi from the most generic to the most particular resembles the adaptive radiation of living species as they split and branch from their ancestors, it is on its own a rather one-sided view of evolution that neglects the enormous amount of convergence, cooperation, and coalescence that's occurred along the way. Amazingly, the Confessor's Logoi vision also takes account of these more constructive, stabilizing forces. In Ambiguum 7, he writes, all created things are positively defined by their own Logoi and by the Logoi that exist around them and which constitute their defining limits. One could interpret this to mean that the Logoi do not just emanate, divide, and cascade, but they also interact creatively en route. For Maximus, this is the main way, in fact, God exercises his providence to counteract the intrinsic instability of the cosmos. It's a delegated providence in which the Logoi bind things together as wholes to parts in a holomeric unity, as Oliveson would say, of unity and distinction. Scientifically, this providence need not be interpreted merely in terms of genetic relatedness, where unity derived from behavioral cooperation is achieved only because of closely related family members, but can also be understood as the complex entanglement of unrelated species that have co-evolved into states of mutual interdependence. So we might then complicate the hierarchical diagram by showing relationships that exist beyond monophyletic groups. So symbioses, cooperations, natural gene transfer, all sorts of other predator-prey relationships. return to some of the comments made by the authors that were the original motivation for this study. Are the Logoi really like spiritual DNA, as Elizabeth Theokritos says? Well, I think so, yes, but only if they are interpreted as the informational coding of the whole universe, not just as the DNA base pairs in living things. This is because the Logoi exhaustively define all things, not just living things, and certainly not just DNA or genes. Secondly, does biological evolution really move forward through various Logoi, as Mark Chenoweth has claimed? Yes, I think they do, indeed, though we must view this movement to be complex and going beyond mere biological evolution, since its completion occurs beyond our current space-time. Finally, is Christopher Southgate correct to say that Logoi correspond to peaks on an adaptive landscape? Well, no, not really, I don't think. The Logoi code for all things, including particulars, not just ideal types. The Logoi are an intrinsic formal cause, not just extrinsic, which means that Maximus's cosmic vision is more than a Platonic participatory vision. My interim conclusions then are that all things, big and small, generic or particular, are fully intended by God and felt by God for Maximus. And creation is evolutionary in the sense that the Logoi are moving hierarchically and interactively from being to eternal well-being. Therefore, my interim conclusion is this evolution must be fundamentally good, since the Logoi is the Logos, and the Logos is good. But now let's come to some of the dissonances. I'll have to speed up and realize it's already. So, immutable, teleological, good Logoi. Maximus does state in many places that Logoi are unchanging, unchangeable. But I think this is to be interpreted as God's mind not changing. So everything is eternally in existence in the divine mind. Although Maximus would undoubtedly believe in the fixity of species, just like all his peers did at the time. Sorry, I'm rushing now because I've reached my 30 minutes. So teleological Logoi. So the notion of purpose in evolution is very controversial. Most biologists would deny there is any overall trajectory, except perhaps in complexity and size. And at first sight, the Maximian Logoi look strangely like the Marcian orthogenesis and pre-formationism, which Darwinism was meant to have abolished. But I don't think that the immanence of the Logoi really poses any threat to evolution. The exhaustive scope of the Logoi's immanence and interrelatedness ensures a causal closure of the universe which is not in competition with God, because they constitute the natural world. And indeed, this immanentist view of God operating within evolution is not new and was a very early 20th century response to Darwinism. I'm thinking here of the Lux Mundi theologians like Aubrey Moore, who are addressing an implicit deism by which you see God just orchestrating like a divine watchmaker. But it does mean that all lineages are sanctified and dignified as having value and purpose, no matter how ephemeral, extinct, contingent, or transitional they are. And I don't have time to really go into the good Logoi. I can kind of bracket this out. I have treated it in my book, and there are different ways of dealing with it. I just say that the Logoi are only the good aspects, and that the Logos therefore suffers as creation as well as with and for creation. An alternative way is to say, no, there are definitely some natural evils created by evolution, and that those are due to a variable mode of existence, propaxios, of even non-human beings. Or else you could bring to bear Gregory of Nyssa's idea of the garments of skin, Genesis 3:21, allegorically as being cumulative remedial concessions that were anticipated by God in anticipation of Adam's sin. And you could split Darwinian evolution into non-garments like variability and adaptation, which are good, and the garments of skin, the concessions, which might be competition and death, predation, things like that. So, in conclusion, I think Maximus's Logoi cosmology does indeed resemble biological evolution, but it goes beyond it. There are some dissonances, which I apologize for rushing through, but I think some of these can be easily resolved. And overall, I would say that Maximus's philosophy of nature is quite panentheistic, though in a very mild sense of panentheism. We've got the Logoi acting in all things, therefore dignifying evolution and all its particulars. So thank you very much.
Thank you for this presentation. And well, I forgot to mention that Dr. Jackson is a biologist, of course, not only a theologian, which makes it even more interesting. And I found out also that you were a student of Richard Dawkins.
Yes, originally.
Yeah. So it brings me to my initial question to set us off. I'm interested in your thoughts about randomness and the relationship between randomness and metaphysics, because at times it seems it's either or. So often biologists or philosophers, biologists like Dawkins, they would insist on absolute randomness, which excludes any kind of teleology or purpose. But is it possible, and what are your thoughts about that, to integrate randomness with purpose? Because that would be potentially the most interesting path. Right? I remember Dennis Noble is using an expression of harnessing randomness.
Right.
And I'm just interested.
Well, the first thing to say, I don't think Richard Dawkins would say evolution is random. I think he would say, he would say that cosmic ray induced mutations may be random because they originate in nuclear reactions, which are quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics get as to true acausality in science, at least. And so everything else is purely contingent, which is, in a way, you could argue is even deterministic. It's all, if you knew enough about the ecosystem, the environment, the phenotypic characteristics, you could, in theory, calculate what's going to survive and what's not going to survive. Not random, contingent, very difficult to predict. That's not the same as ontological randomness, okay? The second thing I would say is with my Maximus spectacles on, I would say that randomness doesn't exist, okay? And one of the applications of my work is to address a resurgence of interest in the design argument for God, which has come about through people finding examples. You've heard of the fine-tuning argument in physics, okay? Well, certain biologists are arguing this similar kind of fine-tuning biology in protein folding, in convergent evolution, things like that. And what they're saying is that these are kind of redolent of design, okay? But think about it, when you say that, what you're saying is all of the stochastic, contingent, apparently aleatoric mechanisms in evolution, all the dead ends, 99% of species have gone extinct. There have been lots of things that didn't survive. All of those are kind of less important to God. They're not parts of his design. Maximus would, I argue, counteract that, say all things, and because there are logoi in all particulars. No matter how much you dissect nature, you can be as ultra-reductionistic as you like, right? The logos is in every part, every atom, every corpuscle. So I think, therefore, it behoves us, if we accept a Maximus framework, to re-examine what we mean by design and randomness, and causality. What looks to be random actually contains far more information than something that's regularly ordered, like a pattern. Therefore, in Maximus's framework, ironically, it takes more design. David Bohm, the physicist, talks about this, that a line that's wavy is actually more purposeful than one that's apparently ordered, because there's a lot more information gone into it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for this very brave attempt. I'm glad that there's a kind of a resurgence of Maximus going on right now.
Yes.
Hearing more about Maximus than ever, and so this is very interesting. I'm sympathetic, and so I'd like to sort of extend the idea, because when we think about evolution, we're sort of thinking about the beginning, the past. And in a Christian theological framework, we also have to think about the end. And when I was listening to you, I kept thinking of the French theologian archaeologist Théard de Chardin. And of course, Théard is this kind of whole idea that everything is evolving towards this omega point, we will spiritualize everything. And my problem with Théard was, well, what about the eschaton, the end of the world, the resurrection of the body, and all these things? And I mean, in this context, with Maximus, who obviously does believe in the resurrection, we have this teleology. If we can account for where things came from, we should be able to say something about where they're going. So this is maybe, since it's a day of naughty questions, what would you? Do you have any thoughts about Maximus's eschatology and what?
Yes,
with that?
I do. Thank you. Great question. So empirically, there's no evidence that evolution has a uniform trajectory. There are multiple trajectories, if you like. There are camera eyes, there are intelligence in different creatures. But if you're trying to think for kind of like a neurogenesis, like Théard's talking about, I don't think you find that. It's a rapidly, profusely expanding bush, as Stephen Jay Gould says, rather than a Christmas tree with an apical point. So that's one thing. Empirically, the data don't support that. Secondly, I think if you were to interpret Maximus in terms of phylogenetic directionality ending up in the eschaton as some kind of super human being or super group of creatures, what does that do to individual lineages? What does it say for individuals? Okay, I think it means that you're leaving behind the fate of individual creatures. So any kind of idea of a cosmic evolution that's transtemporal has to be at the individual lineage level. So everything is deified as an individual. What happens to the phylogenetic lineages? Who knows? It might end up in a heat death. It might lead to massive extinction with some surviving. But I think that's a secondary question. I think the important thing is that the return and the contraction is transtemporal, not to be interpreted like Théard would say in time. That's my view.
Excellent. I'm very sympathetic. I like that. Great.
Thank you for this very rich and exciting paper. Isn't, however, the relationship between metaphysics and science itself, of course, a very complex one? I mean, you could say that Gould's idea that if you wind back evolution from the beginning, could have gone any way, that itself needs to be supported metaphysically. I mean, he takes that as an inference from the data, but there's a sense in which it's a hypothesis that is exceeding the data. And indeed, we find this, indeed, the history of science. I mean, in the 19th century, Richard Owens was one of the most vocal critics of Darwin. And Owens, who was the founder of the museum, the London Museum, the Museum of Natural Science. In fact, he coined the word dinosaur. And his argument against Darwin was straightforwardly Platonic. He said, look, if you consider the array of species that have the same kind of vertebrae, where the genetic, the links are so diverse and the relation links are so remote. The only way of making sense of the data is by assuming some kind of archetype. So you've got an archetypal structure there in the vertebrae emerging in these very diverse species. Of course, that's a Platonic argument, and it's an argument that he was picking up from Coleridge and the Romantics and indeed a kind of Neo-Kantianism, actually. And finally, I remember Pannenberg was quite unusual among German theologians. German theologians generally are very dismissive of any kind of theology that isn't German. Pannenberg was particularly admiring of the Lux Mundi group, and he said because Anglicans had actually taken science seriously in a way in which many German theologians hadn't, and he thought this was He was very admiring of people like Charles Raven
Yes.
and others who were, in a sense, in a tradition going back to the Cambridge Platonists, where the feeling was that theology has to engage with science because otherwise it is stuck in this isolationist mode.
I agree. Yes.
Gregory McIsaac.
It's very interesting. I mean, I feel a bit like a fish out of water. I'm not familiar with these kinds of projects, but yeah, I'm thinking of evolutionary dead ends, right? So evolutionary dead ends.
Dead ends, yes.
Right. So you're arguing that these, Maximus's theory, can not be thought to be terrible. They can be manifestations of the Logos. And excuse me if I'm not using the proper language. So anyway, this makes me think of something that I know a little bit better, which is Plotinus's commentary on Euclid. And he has a really interesting passage on the circle. And he has this theory of what he calls series, right? Where the same thing exists on various levels, from the henads from all the way down, right? And he has, and the circle, what we'd think of as a geometrical circle, occupies the particular level of ideal space before we get into actual space. But the circle, as you could say, a piece of furniture of reality, pre-exists and exists after the geometrical circle. And so before that is the sort of stability and self-possession of the ideas in the divine mind. Below it, it's the recurrence of animal species from birth to death and so on. Seasons, he even says that at a lower level, natural disasters recur at regular intervals so that life isn't destroyed, right? And so, but this one reality is present all the way through, right? It's not just a whole bunch of different things. He has this idea that even the seasons really is this metaphysical reality which begins at the highest, and because the lower are in the higher is absolutely present all the way down, right? So I'm thinking about this, right? If you wanted to, in a way, justify or think about evolutionary dead ends, what I've understood you're saying with Maximus, to expect that animal species would never have dead ends is a level confusion, right? That it would be to attribute to material things a permanence, and why would you? I mean, I wake up this morning and I have my coffee and then I walk into the street and I get hit by a bus, right? That's what happens to me, but it's not what happens to higher beings. So if we're talking about, animals, not just individuals living in time, but a whole species of animals living in time, why would you expect they would have a kind of way of being which in a way is before the material, and yet there's still animal, there's still, you know what I mean?
I think I can see what you're saying, but I think there's a slightly controversial thing about what Maximus is saying in certain fields is that it's not just species, it's particulars, individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the unintelligibility of an individual, right? Its uniqueness, which, I mean, I'm not an expert like you guys on Platonism, but that's not very Platonic to say that an individual has that. You're meant to be able to only understand it through abstracting universals in relation to other things. But Maximus is dignifying.
Well, actually, Plotinus was using the concept of the Logos to try to go beyond the earlier Platonic view of providence as extending only to the universals. So, interestingly, also for Plotinus, the Logos would explain also an individual, although I think in general Logos is like a form in Aristotle in many ways of Plotinus, but also, especially with humans, Plotinus insists that every individual has his own or her own Logos. So I think, but clearly, and I would agree that Christian Platonism is is putting much more emphasis on individuals than Proclus, for instance, or not really?
No, that's in the. I mean, the whole. Sorry. No, I was just saying, but Proclus yes, the providence extends also to individuals.
It's sort of in a way, matter almost drops out. It's just sort of form sort of gets diverse and diverse and worse and worse. And then, it takes on certain characteristics which higher form doesn't have, on which, the things that we would think of as characteristics of individuality, for Proclus, it's just that it's such an awfully low kind of form, right?
Right.
So that's why
Whereas for Maximus, it's equally logos endowed as transcendental universals. It surely does dignify everything. It flattens out everything.
Can I ask precisely about individuation? Because, by the way, thank you, Dr. Jackson, for such a marvelous talk. I always learn a lot from these talks, despite having read the sources, and I really think it's to the credit of the organisers of this conference as well to have such a diverse sort of array of speakers. So thank you for this. Just going back to Ambiguum 7, which is a commentary of, just to remind people that might not be so familiar, of Gregory Nazianzus' oration on love of the poor. What wisdom concerns me, or is it God's will that we, who are a portion of God that has flowed down from above, not become exalted and lifted up, or on account of this dignity to despise our Creator? So this is trying to refute a particular Origenist interpretation of Gregory Nazianzen as part of the context. So this is really a Platonic, intra-Platonic debate in a certain sense. And just to extend your quotation, Andrew, in God, the Logoi of all things are steadfastly fixed, and it is on this basis of these that God is said to know all things before they came into being. For an absolute truth in him and with him are all things, even though all things present and things to come were not called into existence simultaneously with their Logoi or with their being known by God. Instead, in the wisdom of the Creator, individual things were created at the appropriate time in a manner consistent with their Logoi, and thus received themselves as an actual existence as beings. Really remarkable passage. I just, sorry for taking up so long, but I just wanted to just show how remarkable this passage is. I was wondering, my question, I guess, is you mentioned in one of your slides, university through to apophaticism, and you said that at the individual level, this is a very univocal aspect, whereas when we take it in other ways, it's apophatic. I wondered if you could expand a little more on this and what you view as the precise relationship between the individual, later to be termed hekchetas, maybe, and the univocal, and do you see a link between individuation and university? Seemed to be what you were implying in one of your slides.
Well, the reason for using the anachronistic term of university is the combination of the Logoi of particulars and the lack of declension, the lack of diminution. That passage that I read out about, it's as if God, whatever God wants is exactly what he gets, down to the level of particulars. So there is, it seems to me, therefore, some kind of univocal bridging between God and creation, at least at the level of particulars. It's not to say that there isn't participation going on as well at the higher levels in the hierarchy. And as I said, that I think there are two ways in which that doesn't descend into all-out pantheism. The first is the very early stages. Maximus foreshadows Lamas in terms of the energies that surround God. So he's making a distinction between the essence of God, which is beyond being, and the energy or activities of God, which are participatable. Okay, so that's one thing that safeguards against pantheism, because it's not the divine essence that's in creation, it's like the divine energies. The second thing is that on the side of creation, the finite mode of existence, the hypoxios, which, to use an analogy I always use, this just reflects my scientific naivety. I think of information on different media, like in the mind of Beethoven, Beethoven's score, formed in a symphony, on a CD record. It's the same information, that it has different modes of existence.